James Eldon had grown into a man most people forgot existed until he entered a room. There was something about his presence, muted, weathered, maybe even tired, that felt like an old door creaking open. He hadn't always been that way. There was a time in Eldham Vale when his laughter was the loudest at the pub, when his boots were the first on the ground at dawn and the last to leave at dusk. He carved furniture from the wood of the Eldham birch trees with hands that seemed blessed, steady as the morning sun and quick as a fox on the run. The townspeople would say, "James can make wood sing," and that wasn't far from the truth. He built tables that gathered stories, rocking chairs that held grandmother's prayers, and cots that carried newborn dreams. But time, as it always does, carved him too, only it did so without care or polish. His shoulders had begun to round, not from age, but from the weight of silent years. His hair, once as dark as a moonless sky, now wore streaks of winter. The spark in his eyes had dimmed to a glimmer, like a lantern in a room with no one left to light it for. In Eldham Vale, the seasons changed with purpose, but James drifted between them like a man searching for a reason to belong again. He walked with the gait of someone who'd buried too many yesterdays and had no one left to dig up tomorrow. There was an ache in his bones, but he never complained. Men like James were raised to swallow their storms. The house he lived in sat at the edge of a hill that overlooked nothing special, just the curling mist that rolled in from the woods and the sound of wind touching rooftops. It had been a house for two once. There were faint marks on the kitchen wall where someone had measured growth, though no child had ever lived there, just hope. That's what Liana used to call it, the hope wall. She would stand there on quiet evenings and imagine children running around the table, laughter spilling like milk, and James would listen, smiling but silent, unable to commit to a future he couldn't see. Now the wall was just that, a wall. No hope, no laughter. Just peeling paint and old pencil marks left like ghosts who hadn't realized the family had moved on. The house had become a museum of what never came to be. Even the clock seemed to tick out of habit, not necessity. There were days when James would sit for hours without saying a word, sipping lukewarm tea, and staring at the grain in the floorboards like it might spell out a map back to something he once had. The echoes in the house were polite. They never shouted, never accused, but they never let him forget either. A broken doorknob, a cracked photo frame, a drawer that still held one of her hair ties, tucked in the corner like a secret. There were reminders everywhere, but no memories he could touch without burning his fingers. A foolish man spendeth his strength on the wind and calleth it harvest, the pastor once said in a sermon James half heard. He didn't need to hear the rest. He'd lived it. He'd been chasing the wind for years, and now the fields were bare. The invitation to the gala had come folded in ivory parchment, with gold lettering pressed so elegantly it felt like it belonged to a different world. James had found it lying on the front step, slipped between a pile of letters he hadn't bothered to open in days. His name was written neatly, as though someone still cared enough to spell it right. James Eldon, former artisan of Eldham Vale. He stared at the words for a long time, rubbing his fingers across the embossed seal like he might rub a genie from a bottle. The Harvest Night Gala, a tradition older than memory in Eldham Vale. The richest citizens, the town council, the artists, the landowners, they would all gather under one roof, drinking wine that tasted like history and wearing clothes that clung to them like second skins. James hadn't been to one in years. He wasn't sure why he kept the invitation on the mantel instead of throwing it out. Perhaps deep down, even a ghost longs to be remembered. For days he walked past that envelope, pretending he hadn't seen it, pretending it hadn't stirred something in the cellar of his chest. He tried to convince himself he'd feel out of place, that it wasn't his world anymore. But the truth was simpler, sadder. He didn't want to face the truth that he'd become a man who didn't belong anywhere. He had once danced on that stage, laughed with men in suits, stood proudly beside Liana in matching black and gold. But those nights were far behind him, buried under the rubble of choices he couldn't unmake. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? He'd read once in Jeremiah 17 verse 9, and the words clung to him now, years later. The heart wants what it walks away from, when it's too late to turn back. On the night of the gala, The streets glistened with lantern light. The air had that sharp autumn edge to it, the kind that made your bones feel the year's weight. James stood before the mirror, buttoning a shirt that still smelled faintly of cedar from a drawer he rarely opened. He looked at himself as one might look at an old photograph, recognizable yet distant. The suit no longer fit the way it used to. The collar tugged slightly. His hands shook as he reached for the cufflinks. They had been a gift from Liana, once tiny silver knots meant to remind him that life's loose ends must be tied. He had forgotten he even owned them. Sliding them through his sleeves now felt like trespassing in a memory. There was a pause between each breath, like his body was giving him one last chance to turn back. Outside, the town moved like a stage play, actors in gowns, musicians tuning strings, lights glowing against stone walls. The gala was not a place for regret, but he was bringing plenty. Still, he left the house, locking the door behind him with the same quiet finality of someone shutting a chapter they'd never finished. His steps were slow, deliberate, like a man walking to meet his own shadow. Eldham Vale had changed, or perhaps he had. The streets looked the same, but they no longer knew his name. As he neared the hall, he could hear laughter and music spilling out into the evening like perfume. People greeted him kindly, but distantly. A few nodded with polite recognition, the way one acknowledges a faded painting in a familiar gallery. When he reached the doors of the hall, he hesitated, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding that something inside was about to change. "Be sure your sin will find you out," the words from Numbers 32, 23 echoed in his head, not as condemnation but as prophecy. The hall stood tall like a cathedral of old money, its windows stretching skyward as if yearning for a heaven they thought they'd already bought. Inside, chandeliers flickered with amber light, and the air was dressed in perfume, wine, and the quiet notes of a string quartet playing something slow and classical, the kind of tune that made people smile without knowing why. The room itself pulsed with energy, not loud but constant, like a heartbeat beneath silk. Women in gowns moved like waves, and men in fitted suits spoke in voices carefully tuned to power. James stood near the entrance, not quite in, not quite out. For a while he pretended to study architecture, but really he was giving himself time. Time to blend in, time to let the nerves settle, time to remember how to stand tall, though his back now carried more years than pride. He wasn't the James who once swept into rooms with the scent of sawdust still on his skin and a smile cocked just right. He was quieter now, and the corners of his mouth had forgotten how to curl without effort. Yet he was there, breathing the same air as those who had moved far ahead. And in that moment, beneath the chandelier's gold glow, he felt like a man invited into a celebration of a life he never finished building. The laughter around him came like distant thunder. The conversations were full of names he no longer knew, and yet they all floated on by, like riverboats passing a man stranded on the shore. Somewhere near the front, the town mayor adjusted his crimson sash and stepped up to the polished oak podium, with the confidence of a man who had learned to stretch words like butter. Across bread, he tapped the mic once, though it didn't need tapping, and offered the crowd his familiar smile, a politician's smile, full of teeth but empty of answers. "My friends," he began, his voice rising above the chatter, "tonight we honor not just prosperity but perseverance, not just wealth but legacy." James half listened, his eyes wandering across the sea of faces, most of them lifted toward the mayor like sunflowers to the sun. He recognized a few old colleagues, older now, fuller in the face, their eyes less curious than they'd once been. He noticed how easily they smiled. It struck him that time had been kind to some, or at least forgiving. Then the mayor paused. A hush settled in like a snowfall. "This year's recipient of the crown of fortune," he said slowly, "is someone whose name now means more to Eldham Vale than it ever has before. A name synonymous with dignity, brilliance, and quiet resilience." James's spine stiffened without him realizing. Some primal instinct in him braced for the weight of what was coming. "Liana Arden," the mayor concluded, "come and accept your honor." And then the room burst into applause, hands clapping, voices rising, a tidal wave of celebration that James was not prepared for. His breath caught in his throat. Liana, his Liana, no, not his anymore, and not for many years. She walked toward the stage, and the sound of her heels echoed like punctuation in a sentence written just for him. There she was, alive in the flesh, not just a figure in memory. Her presence was no longer the softness he remembered from early mornings and rainy afternoons. She had become something else, refined, poised, wrapped in an emerald green gown that shimmered like the inside of a secret. Her hair was pulled into a simple knot, revealing a neck that held no tension, only grace. The years had not worn her down. They had etched her into something stronger. As she ascended the stage, her eyes scanned the room, not hurriedly, but deliberately, like someone who knew how to be seen and how to choose what she acknowledged. James shrank slightly behind a pillar, unwilling to be found just yet. He watched her place one hand over her heart as the mayor placed the ceremonial laurel crown atop her head, golden and glinting under the stage lights. It should have looked gaudy. Instead, it looked like it had always belonged there. The applause grew louder, some people standing to clap. James didn't move. He felt rooted to the floor, as if the weight of everything he'd once abandoned had finally decided to fall at once. There were moments in a man's life when the world stops just long enough for him to see clearly who he is, what he has done, and what will never come again. For James, that moment stood before him, draped in green and crowned in gold. It was not bitterness that rose in his chest, nor jealousy. It was something more dangerous, regret, pure and unfiltered, the kind that lingers long after the party ends and everyone else has gone home. The ceremony continued, with the mayor recounting Liana's achievements, her companies, her donations, her role in restoring the town library, the scholarships she funded for young women in trade schools. James didn't hear most of it. His mind was a room without windows, echoing with her name again and again, Liana Arden. He still remembered when she first took his last name, when she signed it slowly, awkwardly, like trying on a new pair of shoes. It never quite fit her. Arden suited her better. Clean, sharp, whole. There was irony in that, he thought. She had grown into a name he hadn't given her, made it shine without him. And here he was, a relic in a room full of legacies, watching the one thing he once held slip further out of reach, celebrated by a town that once called him its brightest flame. The applause began to quiet, and Liana stepped up to the microphone. Her voice hadn't changed. Still calm, still low, still wrapped in a kind of gentleness that soothed and cut all at once. I stand here tonight, she said, not just as a woman who built a business, but as a woman who rebuilt herself. James closed his eyes. Each word was a blade, smooth and unforgiving. I thank the town of Eldham Vale, she continued, for never letting me forget who I was, and reminding me who I could become. There was no malice in her voice, only the truth. And sometimes truth is the cruelest kindness. When the ceremony ended, people rushed to take photos with her. James turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps quieter now, like a man who realized too late that some doors once closed don't open again. The cottage felt different that night. Not louder, not quieter, just more aware of its own emptiness. As James shut the door behind him, the click of the latch sounded sharper than usual, as though the house itself had heard Liana's name announced, and now held its breath. He leaned against the wall, coat still on, shoes still wet from the mist, and stared into the stillness. For a long while he didn't move. The shadows from the single oil lamp flickered along the cracked walls, dancing softly like memories that didn't want to be remembered. His hands hung at his sides, fingers twitching slightly, as if they still wanted to reach out and touch the life that had passed him by. His breath came shallow, not from sorrow, not from age, but from a heaviness he couldn't name, as if something sacred had been shown to him, then sealed away forever. Liana. It had been years, and yet her name still carried the weight of something unfinished. He peeled off his coat and draped it over the back of the nearest chair, the motion automatic, mechanical. His eyes drifted to the hearth unlit. The firewood beside it looked like it had been stacked for someone else's winter. At that moment, the cottage did not feel like a home. It felt like a waiting room, one where no one would ever return to call his name. He wandered into the small workshop that adjoined the cottage, where the scent of old cedar and varnish still lingered like a memory refusing to fade. The place was filled with dust and half-finished pieces, a stool missing its final polish, a headboard lying against the wall with uneven carvings he never bothered to smooth out. On the table sat an old photo frame he had once begun to make for Liana's birthday. He picked it up. It was just a skeleton of an idea, the corners still jagged, the surface still raw. He ran his thumb along the edge, and a tiny splinter lodged into his skin. He didn't flinch. Pain, he had learned, was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was the cold realization that you had put off finishing something until the reason for it no longer existed. That frame would never hold her photo now. It belonged to the unfinished things of his life, the promises he once meant but never kept. There had been a time when he and Liana spent hours in this room. She would sit across from him, a cup of chamomile tea in her hands, sketching out ideas while he brought them to life. She was always dreaming, always imagining new spaces to fill. He, on the other hand, had grown tired of the routine, tired of the smallness. He thought the world had more to offer, but the world outside their love had teeth. It chewed him up and left him with nothing but stories that didn't end well. Now the workshop stood still, as if waiting for him to admit it, not just that he had left her, but that he had left the only place where he had ever been truly needed. He made a cup of tea that night, weak and flavorless, and sat by the window, staring into the darkness beyond the hills. Somewhere out there, Liana was celebrating, not just wealth, but a life well lived. People surrounded her. They raised their glasses in her name. They called her wise and elegant and strong. He could almost see it, her smile, the calmness in her voice when she spoke. He wondered if she had laughed tonight. The thought made something ache in his chest, not from jealousy, but from a quiet yearning that sat too deep to uproot. He remembered how she used to hum when she cooked, how she'd leave little notes in his toolbox, simple things like, "Don't forget to eat," or "You are more than your craft." At the time, he had smiled and tucked them away, but he never said thank you. He never saw those notes for what they were, lifelines, love letters hidden in routine. Now he'd give anything to find just one more, but the drawer where he kept them had been emptied years ago, during a night when he was too proud to fight and too blind to stay. He thought he was walking toward freedom, but all he'd found were empty nights and a bed too large for one. "It is not good that the man should be alone." The words from Genesis echoed in his mind, not as scripture, but as confirmation. God had seen this kind of loneliness before, and so had Liana. He rose slowly and walked to the cupboard, pulling out an old bottle of wine someone had given him years ago. It had collected dust, forgotten like most things in his life. He poured himself a glass and took a sip, grimacing at the sourness. It was past its time, just like him. He left the glass on the table and opened the drawer beside it, digging through old receipts and scraps of wood templates. At the very bottom, folded into a tight square, was a letter he hadn't seen in years. Her handwriting, loopy, neat. He didn't need to unfold it to know what it said. It was the last one she'd written to him, the night he left. He had never read it. He didn't need to. The act of leaving had already written its own letter on her heart. He placed it back without opening it, as if to say, "What's the point now? The past doesn't answer questions. It just waits for you to stop asking them." The room had grown colder, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coat again, not to go out, but to wrap himself in something, anything. The warmth of memory was fleeting. He sat back in the chair, eyes on the hearth, and wondered if perhaps some people weren't meant to recover, that some stories don't end in redemption, only recognition. He hadn't just walked out of a marriage, he had walked out of a miracle, and now the miracle has moved on. The morning after the gala, Eldham Vale's market square was alive with its usual rhythm, vendors calling out over crates of apples, steam rising from meat pies, children weaving between barrels, and women haggling over scarves with the same intensity as gamblers at a high-stakes table. But to James it all moved slower now. He wasn't sure if the world had softened, or if he had simply grown too brittle to move with it. Every sound, every color, every face, it all reminded him of how much time had passed since he truly belonged to this town. He walked with hands buried deep in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly stooped, as if apologizing to the wind for taking up too much space. His eyes scanned shop signs not out of need but out of habit, until he paused at one freshly painted board above a gleaming glass storefront. Arden Furnishings. The letters were golden, curling at the ends like calligraphy in a royal scroll. The window display behind it showed a handcrafted table set with ivory porcelain and lavender sprigs, elegant yet simple, the kind of beauty that whispered rather than shouted. He stood there for a long time, watching people walk in and out, carrying chairs, frames, and wrapped packages, all marked with her seal. It hit him, quietly but forcefully, that her name now lived where his once did. Not as an echo, as an empire. He had left a woman with blueprints in her hands. Now she had built the house without him. The smell of roasted chestnuts pulled him from the window, and he turned instinctively toward the scent, ending up near the vendor stalls on the eastern side of the square. The air was spiced and warm, a comforting contrast to the gnawing thoughts clawing at his mind. He bought a bag of chestnuts without really tasting them, and wandered down a narrower lane where the buildings leaned slightly, like old men sharing gossip. There, on the side of a stone building, was a mural he hadn't noticed before. It showed a young woman kneeling beside a child, handing him a wooden toy boat. Painted in the corner was a line, crafted by Arden's Hope Initiative. The words were unfamiliar, but the style of the boat was not. It was the same type James used to make during the lean months, when people couldn't afford full furniture, but still wanted something handmade to give their children. He used to carve them with scraps and sell them for barely enough to cover his tea. Liana had once asked him why he didn't charge more. Because kindness should cost less than comfort, he'd said without thinking. And now it seemed she had taken that truth and planted it deep into the soil of her success, Arden's hope. He whispered the words aloud and felt something stir, an ache somewhere between pride and shame. There was no denying it anymore. She had not only moved on, she had carried the best parts of their past forward while he remained standing in place. At the corner of Holloway Street, just before the baker's shop, he saw her again, this time not on a stage or a poster, but in the flesh. Liana stepped out of a black car, graceful in a burgundy coat, hair pulled back, smile soft but firm. A little boy ran up to her, waving a paper plane, and she knelt to admire it as if it were a gift from heaven. There was no camera watching her, no audience to impress. She simply cared, and the townspeople noticed. Passers-by nodded warmly, one elderly man even tipping his cap. A young woman carrying books stopped to hug her, and Liana listened, truly listened, as the girl spoke. That was her gift, James remembered. She could make you feel like the only voice in a crowded room. He stayed hidden, watching from behind a newsstand, feeling like an intruder in a story that no longer had his name in the credits. She seemed happier now. Not in the loud way of someone escaping something painful, but in the steady, rooted way of someone who had survived and bloomed. He wanted to call out to her, to say something, anything, but all the words he could find in his throat were stale, like bread left too long on the shelf. Instead, he turned away. His feet carried him down the alley and into silence. He didn't look back. Part of him feared that if he did, he would see her look past him, as though he was just another man she once knew. That night, he sat at his workbench and stared at a block of cherry wood, untouched. His tools lay scattered around it like forgotten soldiers after a battle. He picked up a chisel, then set it down, picked up a plane, then set it down again. Nothing spoke to him. Nothing stirred his hands. He had always believed that the wood talked to him, that the grain would whisper its purpose, if only he was quiet enough. But now it said nothing. The silence in the room was not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that carried weight. He poured a cup of water and let it sit untouched beside him, watching the slow rise of steam until it disappeared. A knock came at the door, but when he opened it, no one was there. Just a note pinned to the frame, Community Craft Drive, sponsored by Arden Foundation. Volunteers welcome. The corner of the note was smudged, the ink slightly running from the fog. He held it for a long time, then folded it and placed it on the workbench, beside the cherry wood. He didn't know if he'd go. Maybe he would. Maybe he wouldn't. But one thing was certain, Eldham Vale was no longer waiting for him to catch up. The town had turned the page. And while James sat clutching the chapter he never finished, the rest of the story had written itself without asking for his pen. The evening of the private gathering arrived without ceremony. There was no gilded invitation this time, just a casual mention in passing from an old acquaintance at the Carpenters' Guild. Liana's friend Elric is hosting a smaller affair after the gala. Less noise, more real conversation, the man had said, swirling his teacup absently, as if inviting James into an old memory rather than a party. At first, James had no intention of going. He didn't belong in those circles anymore, not even the quieter ones. But something in him was restless. It wasn't hope. Hope had long since packed its bags and moved out of his chest, but curiosity, perhaps, or that stubborn ember of longing that never quite died out. He stood before his closet that afternoon, staring at the same few shirts and jackets he'd owned for years. None of them felt right. They smelled of varnish, dust, and solitude. He picked the cleanest one, buttoned it slowly, and combed his hair with the kind of care a man reserves for moments he might regret. The walk to Elric's home was a quiet one, tucked along the old stone lane near the river, where the houses had arched windows and ivy curling like old handwriting along the walls. As he approached the doorway, candlelight spilled through the windows and laughter drifted through the air, faint but warm. His hand paused at the doorknob. He stood there for a full breath, maybe two. Then, with a resolve that didn't quite reach his bones, he stepped inside. The house was filled with familiar faces made strange by time, not in the way that made you forget them, but in the way that made you wonder how you could have ever known them so well. The furniture was antique, the lighting soft, the scent of rosemary and lemon oil hanging in the air like a memory. Conversations rose and fell like distant waves, punctuated by the occasional clink of glass or soft music playing from an old record player in the corner. James lingered by the doorway for a while, unnoticed, until someone offered him a drink. He accepted with a nod, then moved toward the edge of the room, where a wide window looked out onto the garden. It was easier to look out than in. From his place near the curtain, he caught fragments of stories and laughter, nothing loud, but all full of ease. These were people who had moved on, rebuilt, planted new things in the soil of old heartbreaks. And then the room shifted. It wasn't the lighting or the music. It was something unspoken, an awareness that passed between guests, like a ripple across still water. She had arrived. James didn't turn immediately. He kept his eyes on the garden, but his breath caught before he could stop it. He didn't need to see her to know. Her presence was like the change in weather, sensed, not announced. When he finally turned, she was already speaking to someone. A small group gathered around her. She wore a dark blue dress, simple, elegant, the fabric hugging her frame with grace rather than indulgence. Her laughter floated across the room like it belonged there, and perhaps it did. She did. He waited until the crowd around her thinned, then approached with slow, measured steps. There was no plan in his mind, no script, just a deep, aching need to say something that might matter. As he neared, Liana turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his with a calm that made him feel both seen and gently dismissed. It wasn't coldness, it was distance, the kind built over years of healing. She didn't flinch, didn't smile either, just regarded him with that familiar stillness, the kind that once comforted him and now made his throat dry. "Liana," he said, voice softer than he'd intended. "You look, well." Her expression didn't shift. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Hello, James," she said, her tone not unkind, but carefully neutral, like a song played on a single string. For a long pause, neither spoke. The music played on. Glasses clinked in the background. Then he cleared his throat. "I saw you at the gala." Her eyes flickered, acknowledging the statement without confirming it. "You've done incredibly well," he continued. "More than I ever imagined." She nodded once. "Thank you." He wanted to say more. Wanted to say, "I'm sorry," or "I see now," or "I never stopped carrying the version of us that could have been." But all he said was, "You deserve it." That caught something in her, a flicker brief but unmistakable. "We all deserve something," she replied. "The difference is some people stay long enough to build it." The words didn't sting like a slap. They sank, slow and deliberate, like a stone settling at the bottom of a well. The rest of the night passed like a dream half remembered. They didn't speak again, not directly. She moved through the room like someone with purpose, speaking to friends, laughing softly, occasionally glancing in his direction, but never long enough to invite anything more. James remained near the window, sipping a second drink that tasted like melted ghosts. Every so often, someone would approach him, someone who remembered the old shop, who asked how he was doing, who smiled kindly and moved on, but none of it anchored him. He felt like a photograph pinned to a wall at a party he was never really part of. At one point, Elric came over, clapping him on the back and talking about something he didn't fully hear. His mind was with her, watching her. Not in the way a man watches someone he wants, but in the way a man watches someone who has become too whole to be reached again. Near the end of the night, as guests began to leave, Lyanna stepped out into the garden. James waited a moment, then followed. He didn't speak. Just stood beside her beneath the tree, both of them watching the moonlight pool on the grass like spilled silver. After a long silence, she spoke. "Some things," she said, "were never meant to be lost, but we lose them anyway." He didn't reply, because sometimes silence is the only language sorrow understands. She turned to go, her steps light, unhurried, and as the garden swallowed her figure into shadow, James felt it, something final. Not dramatic, not cruel, just final. Some goodbyes do not need doors slamming or tears shed. Some goodbyes are simply the absence of a second chance. The years moved like fog through Eldham Vale, quiet, thick, and without urgency. There were no grand shifts, no fireworks in the sky, just the kind of change that creeps in through the back door and rearranges the furniture of your life when you're not looking. James remained in his cottage on the hill, the one with creaking windows and a hearth that rarely burned. Days passed in predictable silence. Breakfast by the window, a walk through the woods, a few half-hearted attempts at carving. He still received the town paper, though he mostly scanned it for updates about her, new projects, another foundation, awards given quietly without her ever boasting. Lyanna's name became not just respected in Eldham Vale but revered, like a landmark people pointed to when giving directions through their own stories. James never spoke of her to anyone, not out of bitterness, but reverence, the kind that doesn't belong in casual conversation. There are memories so delicate that to speak them aloud is to risk shattering them, and so he carried them silently, like a sealed envelope in the pocket of his soul. Sometimes on Sundays he would pass by her old boutique on purpose. He didn't enter, just walked slowly, hands in his pockets, pretending to be headed somewhere else. But inside, he always hoped he might catch a glimpse of her through the window, browsing fabric, laughing with someone, existing in the version of life he never stayed long enough to deserve. The bench came to him one morning like a whisper. He had been staring at a blank piece of walnut wood, unable to decide what it should become. And then the thought arrived, whole and steady. A bench, not just any bench. One built with care, polished with quiet, and placed not in his home, but beneath the old maple tree that stood between her street and the village square. That tree had stood the test of every season, shedding and blooming again without apology, without announcement. Just like her, he spent a week building it. Not rushed, not distracted, each plank sanded by hand, each joint fastened like a prayer. He didn't design it with flair or flourish. It was plain, strong, honest, the kind of seat that welcomed tired feet and listening hearts. When it was done, he didn't sign it, didn't brand it with a logo or his name. He simply placed it beneath the tree one gray morning, while the mist still clung to the ground like a child afraid to let go. He stood back and stared at it, the shape of it framed by golden leaves and the soft hush of the wind. There was no note, no plaque, just a place to sit and remember. And then quietly he left. He didn't expect anyone to know he'd built it. That wasn't the point. Some things aren't meant to be seen. They're meant to be felt. She found it weeks later. James didn't know exactly when. Only that one afternoon, while picking up supplies near Holloway Street, he caught sight of her walking slowly toward the bench. She was alone. No assistant, no press, just a cup of coffee in her hand and a scarf wrapped neatly around her shoulders. She paused as she reached the tree, tilting her head at the bench like it had spoken to her in a language only she understood. Then she sat for a long time. She didn't check her phone. She didn't fidget. She simply looked forward, sipping her drink, feet gently rocking with the breeze. James watched from across the square, hidden behind a cart of fresh vegetables, his heart louder than the chatter around him. She touched the armrest gently at one point, ran her fingers over it like one does when remembering a tune they haven't heard in years. And then, when the cup was nearly empty and the sky had begun to dim, she stood and walked away. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just the quiet dignity of someone who'd been spoken to without words. That night, James didn't sleep. He sat by his window, the sky dark and wide, thinking of how people pass each other in this life, how they love, how they break, and how sometimes, without realizing, they leave behind a piece of themselves in the shape of something that lasts. The last time he saw her was not in person, but in the pages of the local journal. There was a photo, her standing beside a group of young artists in front of a new community center. She wore a dark coat and gloves, smiling but not performing. The article praised her vision, her leadership, and most of all, her quiet generosity. James clipped the page, not to worship it, but to hold it. He folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer beside the original sketch she had once drawn for a nursery they never built. The drawer held other things now too, small tokens of a life half-lived, or maybe twice felt. He wasn't unhappy. He had come to terms with what he had lost, not in a way that demanded forgiveness, but in a way that allowed him to breathe without crumbling. There are kinds of love that don't get a second act, and that's all right. Not every story needs a reunion to be complete. Some find their closure in the quiet spaces between what was and what could never be. James lived out the rest of his days as a man who once carved wood and love with equal care. And though his hands slowed and his back ached more with each passing winter, he always found time to pass by the bench. Sometimes he sat, sometimes he just nodded at it in silence, and once, near his final years, he whispered a verse as he touched the smooth armrest, his voice thin, but certain. Her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her. He smiled softly then, not because he had reclaimed anything, but because he had finally understood what he let go. Sometimes, life teaches us its deepest lessons not in the moment we make a decision, but in the silence that follows. James walked away from a garden before it ever bloomed. He didn't cheat, he didn't fight, he just drifted. And that's how many people lose good things, not through destruction, but through neglect. Dear listener, if you are blessed with someone who loves you gently, someone who builds with you slowly, someone who believes in your quiet potential, do not let them go because of boredom, pride, or noise from the world. You don't always get another chance, and not every story ends with a door you can knock on again. If you are healing from someone who left, know this. You are still capable of becoming the best version of yourself. You do not need to stay broken to prove your love was real. Liana didn't wait in sorrow. She grew, she rose. And maybe that's your message tonight. What you thought was the end could be the beginning of something stronger. Forgive if you must. Walk away if you need to. But never stop watering your own soul, and never take a good heart for granted. There are some people you'll never get back, but there are also some versions of yourself that only appear after the storm. Now let's all pray together. Prayer. Heavenly Father, we come before you tonight with open hearts and quiet spirits. We've listened to a story that mirrors real life, a story of love, loss, regret, and redemption. And now we ask that you help us walk away not just entertained, but transformed. For the one listening who has walked away from something good, Lord, give them the courage to return if it's not too late. And if it is, give them peace, wisdom, and a heart that will not repeat the same mistake again. For the one who was left behind, Lord, restore their strength. Heal the parts of them that were made to feel unworthy. Let them rise, not with bitterness, but with quiet dignity, just like Liana. May they grow into all that you've called them to be, with or without applause. For every listener struggling with regret, let them know you are the God of second chances. And even when doors close, windows of grace remain open. Teach them to find purpose in the pieces and beauty in the rebuilding. Let us not take love for granted. Let us not walk away from blessings disguised as routines. Let us learn to cherish what matters, to speak when silence would destroy, and to stay when it's easier to leave. Let our hearts be humble. Let our choices be wise. Let our future be brighter than the pain of our past. In your mercy, Lord, Give us clarity before we ruin something beautiful. And if we've already ruined it, give us healing that cannot be stolen. In the name of Jesus Christ, the one who restores broken things, we say Amen. If this story and prayer touched your heart, type Amen in the comments below. Let it be a seed of faith, a mark of healing, a prayer you've released into God's hands. Your Amen might be the echo someone else needs to hear.